Hello, I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about how to plan out a podcast. Now, our outline for today's episode, we're going to be looking first very briefly at the history of podcasts and where we are today with the market, or why you should care about podcasting. Number two, we're going to look at an assignment at ACU that asked you to create a podcast and dissect some of those instructions. And then we're going to look at 10 habits of effective podcasts, of ones that grow an audience, that sustain an audience, that people say, you know what, I'd like to hear more by these people. And we're going to relate those back to the learning objective number two, to this specific assignment, and show how some features of the assignment instructions are actually guiding you towards those effective habits. So let's look at the history of podcasts. Now, you have on the right the opening of an article that ran in The Guardian in 2004, describing, as you can see from the headline, an audible revolution, a change in how people were listening to music, to talk, to episodes that previously would have had to run on broadcast video or on subscription VHS and DVD series, things that had become available in a new way, such that they said these terms are no longer sufficient. Just calling it online radio isn't encompassing how this is different from what's come before. And so Ben Hammersley, writing this piece, suggested a number of different words. Audio blogging, that was used for a while. Guerrilla media, in opposition to mainstream media. Podcasting, which is the one that ended up taking off. And so this is coming from a combination of the growing availability of inexpensive but high quality home audio recording that made things that had previously required professional studios to make now being accessible to people with computers at home and perhaps a little bit of extra equipment. And also, very importantly, the advent of inexpensive or sometimes even free to the users online distribution. And this is huge because it costs a lot to operate a radio station. You need to have whatever content creation facility, but you also have to have the broadcasting towers. Not so much with podcasting, where many operations are just one person with their computer and a microphone. And it is really big business now. The world market for podcasts last year was in excess of $30 billion of revenue. And if we break down the US market, there are 160 million US users who are listening to a podcast at least once a month. In fact, 48% of US men listen to a podcast at least once a month. Now, those of you who've watched for a while know that I will seed in things here where you should be looking for things that tell you you should be proofreading more. And when you are planning something that you're going to read out loud, you will see things like this that pop out to your eyes. So podcast is not a word, podcast is the one. So whenever you are doing a practice run, make sure you go through every slide because that will help you catch things like this, including when you are planning out the outline for your podcast. You don't have to stop or edit something out in your practice run. You'll have gone over everything and said, wait, that doesn't sound right. Now, one of the very interesting things for marketers is knowing that there are different bands and usage patterns. The people who are listening to podcasts in different age groups vary. And for groups that you are trying to chase with disposable income, most frequent podcast listeners are 12 to 54-year-olds. Well, 12-year-olds aren't exactly known for having a lot of disposable income, but they grow up to people who have a disposable income pretty quickly. And it's expected that as the people who are currently in their 50s listening to podcast age, that market will continue to expand older and older and older while retaining the younger demographics. Because now I was actually at a doctor's office this morning and someone was saying, oh, yes, my 8-year-old listens to podcasts to work on her English. Well, that is telling you how great the penetration is. So already podcasts make up 20% of people's listening time. That's not just counting podcasts versus radio, That's podcasts, radio, television. 20% of all that. That is a big deal. Now, so if we take the US podcast market and separate it from the world podcast market, which you will recall was looking at greater than $30 billion last year, we have 40% of the US radio market equivalent being the US podcast market. So it's about $8 billion annually in the US just for podcasts. And that's been growing steadily. And it's expected in a couple of years that it's going to be equal to half the size of the US radio market, in part because you can target your listeners in the distribution platforms that place ads on these podcasts. You can target your users much more narrowly. So, for example, if I download a podcast while I'm in France, I get advertisements in French. If I download a podcast while I'm in, say, Illinois, I get ads for things near Illinois. And that is very valuable to advertisers. And also, if you want your ads to be relevant to you because you like to learn about things to that, awesome. And there's now a growing degree of crossover. Some of the more successful podcasts have been picked up for radio, and many successful radio shows have become podcasts as well. All right, let's take a look at this assignment here. We're looking at BITO 342's Week 4 assignment number 1, the podcast Encountering Hidden Worldviews. So this is coming out of our Christianity and culture class. And if we look at it and glance, there's a lot of text here. So what I always recommend is that you go through and you parse this text to find out what it is telling you, here's some things to think about before you venture in, and what's the actual instructions. And in this case, they have given a rather lengthy paragraph to describe the purpose of the assignment. And if we just control what we're looking at for a little bit, it becomes a lot easier to see what they're trying to tell us. Oh, the purpose this week's assignment builds on the week 2 one by giving more practice of putting your thoughts into words, with the specific prompt being thinking about Christians engaging with culture. Further, this assignment gives you an opportunity to do something that many people never do, to look closely at our culture and within yourself, and to see how you may have been, quote unquote, infected by the worldviews described in the reading. Which is to say, how can you recognize the things in you and how they became that way? What caused you to acquire these ideas, these beliefs, these things that you hold to be true? And the preamble continues, it's only by recognizing the weaknesses and struggles within ourselves that we can engage them and, where appropriate, gain some victory over them. Further, if we are going to engage our cultures faithfully, we must know ourselves as fully as possible. But we can't stop at knowledge. One of the weaknesses of this book is that it can lead us to think that if we just know the right information, then we will be fixed. That is a powerful idea. And as a quick aside, there was a movement in early Christianity, the Gnostic movement, that believed that knowing certain knowledge meant that you would be saved. And, well, that's something that this assignment grapples with. As the last point says, that's not true, and this assignment gives you the opportunity to plan action. All right, let's continue. We're moving towards the instructions, and now it's pointing more towards what you're doing. You spent the week reading Sanford and Wilkins, the first text, finding examples of a particular worldview, and discussing them with your classmates. Now you'll spend some time reflecting on one of the worldviews you read about this week that you see most prevalently in your own life. The assignment, now we're getting here's what you're going to make. The assignment will be a 7 to 9 minute podcast in which you will select the hidden worldview you see most manifest in your life. Individualism, consumerism, and nationalism. Now, I've occasionally had students come to ask me for help with this assignment. And so I do want to point out that you are being given a list of 3 specific things. Pick one. Do not make your own up unless you've cleared that with the professor. You're being given a list of 3 things, so pick one of those to delve into. All right, so part 1. How is this going to be broken down? Well, first with an introduction and overview lasting 2 or 3 minutes. In this first part of the podcast, you will provide evidence from your own practices through specific, concrete examples connecting the worldview you chose in your everyday life. And we have this additional prompt. Think about the conversations you engage in, whether in person or virtually on social media, the media you consume, podcast, news, books, TV, etc., and your community, friends, family, church, etc. Now, whether you print this out as a piece of paper or whether you make a PDF and annotate it electronically, this is a good point to pause and quickly just draw in some of those things. For example, I might go ahead and list, for example, the New York Times is a paper I read regularly. Podcasts. Okay, if I'm going to be listing podcasts that I like and listen to regularly, one of them is one called Gastropod, which has a lot of looking at food through the lens of science and technology. Books, TV, etc. Your community. Well, I work at a church. I'm on the music team for a Presbyterian church. So there are things that I'm hearing from the pulpit, from that community, but also my larger family, my key friends who I talk with about such things. And so if you start making a list of these things, you'll probably have more than enough to draw on to fill that time. So then you can start being selective about picking the best and most representative. After that introduction, we have worldview discussion and reflection, where we have a little establishing context again. Stanford and Wilkins provide positives and negatives for each worldview, still reflecting on the worldview that you see most manifest in your life. You should, using that chapter, pick one positive and one negative about that, giving evidence with concrete examples. And about the negative, think about how you might manage them. Now we have some additional prompts for that last point. What resources from the Christian tradition might aid in managing or preventing them? Is there a particular spiritual discipline? Is there a particular portion of the Bible or theology? Now, we'll come back to this, but when you think about what resources from the Christian tradition, you might keep in mind that not all the books of the New Testament were written down at the same time. You have things like the Pauline letters, Paul to the Corinthians, Paul to the Ephesians, and so forth, which are supplementing the oral tradition with written guidance. Is there a particular portion of the Bible or the theology that you see might be relevant to you? Well, if some scripture comes to mind, make a note about that. If there's something beyond scripture, make a note about that. Used to work for a Methodist church. The Methodists have a book that they call the Book of Discipline that sets forth, here are the things that we agree as Methodists are our faith, our core beliefs. Other traditions have their own. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has their additional scriptures. You have other faiths with their own. You have, for example, if we're to take Judaism, you have all these commentaries on the Torah that have formed their own body, the Talmud, their own body of expanded beliefs and discourses and debates that help people navigate problems. We also have, in what ways might Smith's book, You Are What You Love, aid in helping you reflect on healthy engagement with and manage the potential pitfalls of this worldview? So these are questions. They're not rhetorical questions. They're ones that you should engage with and answer. They also might be questions that you ask your readers to think before you propose an answer or guide them through thinking about it. And then we have a conclusion, 2 minutes, where you are supposed to present what plan of action you are thinking about adopting to help manage the potential problems. And if you are having some questions about the technical aspects of creating the recording, we have an additional resource. If we look at the rubric for this, it is basically saying, hey, do all those things in the outline. And we see that they are assigned different amounts of points, of which the podcast being of the target length, 7 to 9 minutes, and being clear and easy to understand, that's 10%. That's the difference between an A and a B, or a B and a C. So please pay attention to that. But also we see that the very first thing is identifying the worldview considered to be most prevalent in your lives. I've seen a number of assignment drafts where people skip this one thinking, oh, well, I'm going to get to that later, and they never actually do. So make sure you start with that because, again, that is the difference between an A and a B or a B and a C. All right, we're going to come back to the assignment instructions after we talk about some of the habits of effective podcasts. The first one I'd like to tell you about is to establish your credibility in your intro. Most podcasts start with an introduction to what the podcast is and who the people in the podcast are. And there are multiple paths for establishing your credibility. For example, you could establish your personal authority. What are your credentials? Is this work experience? Is this academic research? Are these the degrees or initials or certifications that you have? External authority, are there guests or sources that are backing up what you're saying? Earned respect. What is your track record with this audience? Relatability. Tell us who you are and what aspects of you are relatable to your audience. And it's okay if you say, hi, I'm a college student. I'm a college undergraduate who is whatever age and grappling with this on my own, because there will be other people who say, oh, I'm that or something like that. And I can identify with this. And I want to know what someone in a similar situation to me is thinking, believing, finding. So whichever it is, make sure you don't just say, oh, my name is so-and-so. Tell us who you are and tell us something about the credibility that you are bringing to the podcast, whether it's your personal authority, external authority, earned respect, or your relatability. Timeliness is also one that people often leave out. Why is it important to respond to this now? Yeah, if we're going to talk about this assignment, the easy one is to say, well, there are a lot of people upset right now. And so there are a lot of questions about, well, why do I believe what I believe? Why do these other people believe what I do? It's a major thing in the United States and in a lot of the rest of the world, with some pretty big questions about what the international world and what our domestic nation are going to look like. You also want to reduce distractions. And the easiest starting point is the best microphone that you have. So for example, right now, there's a microphone built into my laptop. It's not bad, but I also have my iPod Pros or Apple AirPods or what they're currently called. And they have a much higher quality microphone. And it doesn't matter if I turn my head from left to right, because I have a microphone on the left side and the right side, the sound remains even and centered, which is easier for a lot of people to hear versus if I look off to the side and now I'm talking away from my microphone and you lose part of the wording that I have. If you're using a microphone that has noise cancellation abilities, turn it on. You don't have to turn it up all the way, but turn it on and that will screen away a lot of the distracting little noises, which could be just you're chewing. It could be you have a bird nearby singing. It could be you have a fan going and that you are, for whatever reason, unable to screen out. Now, sometimes you can, though. And so you can block out distractions by doing things like closing the windows and doors, turning off the air conditioner, sending pets out of the room, etc. Now, it is the summer. And for those of you who are in Texas, it is a Texas summer. So toasty with more humidity than we would like in some parts of the state right now. And so you might be something where you turn on the AC, cool the room for a good bit, and then you turn it off to give you time to record. And that is your way of removing that distraction without roasting. You can also, because you're pre-recording this, you can edit out any ums or long pauses, mistakes that you make, and other extraneous sounds. If you're doing this, you will do yourself a big favor if you watch the recording timeline and when you stop because you need to restart, you back up to the part before you made the mistake and then restart from there. Or if you're just doing one continuous recording and then you're going to edit later, just write down quickly approximately where that mistake was so it'll be easier and faster for you to edit it later. You also want to speak at a moderate pace. Now, there are different gradations here, and some of that will depend on whether you're giving a conversational tone or a lecture tone. Let me demonstrate. So I think this is an issue that a lot of people can relate to. That's more or less the speed that I would be talking to someone else here. But if I was in a lecture hall, it takes a bit more time for the sound to travel. And so how you speak, how you enunciate, how you leave space between the words, and especially between the sentences, is key to how people are hearing. Now, some of this is the subject matter, some of it is how people experience it. Because one of the reasons that people sometimes listen to podcasts is they want that feeling of intimacy. Or they might want the feel that, there are a lot of other people listening for something's other. It depends. Which atmosphere are you going for? Either is fine, but what you don't want to do is rush. Don't speak like this. This is going to cause people to have to stop and listen to your thing slower. Make sure that you emphasize keywords and concepts as you go along. That can include defining them, but your voice should be dynamic in the reading, not all at one level, not just one drone here. We want some ups and downs to help us hear what is more important, which things should be standing out. In your notes, you can use bolding or italicization to remind yourself this is a key word, a phrase, or a quotation. And I want the listener to be paying attention, so I'm going to read it like it should be paid attention to. Also, outline your content. This is a big mistake. I've had someone come in and they had recorded about 30 minutes of content for this assignment, which should again be 7 to 9 minutes because they hadn't outlined. And so they just kept talking and talking and talking. And because of that, they did not really get much in and before they ran out of time. And so if you make a list of here are the specifics to do, and you're keeping track of your time, like, oh, I've got an extra 30 seconds for this section. It's easy for you to add on, but make sure you get the important things first. And so when you're outlining, usually just bullet point notes are enough for people if you practice with them. And if you find, oh, I should mention this, write it down. If you find, oh, I needed to spend a little time racking my brain for these details, write it down. So update your outline and make sure that your outline includes the intro and the conclusion. Remember, the conclusion should be about 2 minutes and it's given a good amount of points too. You want to practice your delivery. Generally, 3 rounds of reading aloud is going to be enough. The first is just, you don't need the microphone. That's knowing I'm reading through it. I'm probably going to be making some clarifications, some editing, maybe move some stuff around. This is just to get you reading through it. The second time, you want to practice with the microphone, making sure you're not pausing unless absolutely necessary. And it is always good to pretend that you have an audience in front of you because that helps keep you engaged, keeps you energetic, and gives you a much more accurate idea of the time that you will spend in giving your presentation. And the last time, the third here, is to record with the microphone fully engaged. Now, what it means for that will vary by the person, but generally, it's a little bit more energy, a little bit louder. And in terms of those ups and downs that help us call a reading or voice or podcast or melodic, that where these ups and downs reflect the material and help call our attention to the key points. Those things are what you can put in when you're being fully engaged. And it's easier to do it if you're not fully engaged all the time. So give yourself a little leeway to focus on the content in the first 2 run-throughs. But for the last one, treat it as if you're doing it in one take. Be fully engaged the whole time that you're being recorded, even if you're going back to make some edits later. Another tip, ask questions that you answer. In APA style, you normally don't pose rhetorical questions. But in a podcast, especially when people are doing other things like driving or cleaning the house, these questions give them some time to think and process and become invested in the response and explanation that you're going to be given, because it invites them to think, well, what if I was the expert? What if I was the person who had to solve this? How do I feel about this? And now you're in a conversation and you remember it, you retain it. These become more vivid because it become personal to you. Now, if you as a podcaster are stating the question and it takes a while for you to get around to answering it, make sure that you restate the question before the answer so they know, oh, yes, this is what it's going for. You also want to plan some key moments in your podcast. Now, there are some that you can take from print journalism. What's your hook? What's going to be the first thing that catches your listeners' initial interest? In a newspaper, this is usually the headline, but it could also be the first sentence. How do you grab them and bring them in? You can present a dilemma. Why are or aren't things a certain way? Why is it that, for example, Baltimore has such a high percentage of renters compared to many other American cities? Boundaries. What are the things you are and aren't going to discuss? It's totally okay to say, for more detail, go see this. We're not going to be talking about this because of that. And tell us about the stakes. Why does this thing that you're discussing matter? And what should people be leaving with? Now, coming back to that earlier point about boundaries, don't try to do everything. If there's an external resource that you have, go ahead and refer people to that. A lot of people love having their appetite whet by something and then going to follow up with more detail on their own time. Acknowledge who you are and acknowledge what the limitations are. Did you go and do research in this archive? Did you find it through this book? That's a way of showing, hey, here's what I did. If you want more, here's some steps that you can follow. And don't sell yourself short, to make sure that you're selling yourself to your listeners. You're doing a lot of work, tell them about that. That will help people become more interested, especially when they're respecting, well, they put a lot of time into this. Well, they read these things. Oh, they talked with these people, whatever it is. Now, if you are creating your outline and you're saying, okay, I'm having trouble organizing this, and you want feedback, you can absolutely make an appointment with the Online Writing Center by going to my.acu.edu and under groups, selecting Online Writing Center and following the instructions. But if we're just going back and looking at a rubric here, let's think about some of the things that we were given in our 10 habits here. So if we look at the rubric, we see, identified and described at least one positive and negative aspect from Sanford and Wilkins. That tells me that when you are discussing this section here, you should absolutely be referring to the authority. Sanford and Wilkins said this was a negative. Sanford and Wilkins said this is a positive. Remember when I said, tell us who you are? Well, we have concrete examples from your own conversations. Okay, who are you and what did you bring to this conversation with someone else? What did they bring? What are the interactions in your community and what makes them meaningful to the people involved? Now, when you're talking about the things that you have engaged with, very likely there'll be something that other people have engaged with as well. Let's say, for the sake of example, that you picked one of the Pauline letters in the New Testament. Great, there are lots of commentary on that from other people trying to engage with that. So let us know about some of that. And when you're discussing your plan of action here, are there people who say this is something that is important, who agree with the kind of plan of action that you're doing or the need for a plan of action? Well, connect us to that. Now, don't forget to establish your credibility. What are you bringing here? And when we look at this, we see the evidence from your own practices. So remember that it's not just what you do, but who you are and how you do it that matter. So tell us who you are and do that in the introduction. You can expand on it later, but start with, who are you? What do you bring? Why are you doing this podcast beyond the class? Why are you doing this podcast? What makes it important to you? All right, I think we're going to wrap up there. So let's just do a quick review of our 10 habits of effective podcasting. Establish your credibility with your intro, reduce distractions, speak at a moderate pace, emphasize keywords and concepts, outline your content before you speak, practice your delivery, ask questions that you answer in the course of the podcast, plan key moments to catch your reader's attention and periodically gather and refocus them. Don't try to do everything, and so acknowledge the process that it took to find this information, referring listeners to external resources, and make sure that you sell yourself. Tell us about the work that you put in and how this resonates with your background, why this is important to you, because people care a lot more when they see that the person who's saying or doing something cares about that thing. All right, that brings us to the end of our podcast creation webinar today. So if you were recording this for your podcast, you'd go back and edit out that little pause that I had. But we're doing a live webinar here, so that's how it'll be. So if you have a question, you can email us at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. To schedule an appointment, go to my.acu.edu. Under Groups, select the Online Writing Center and follow the instructions. And you can also go to our website directly, blogs.acu.edu/online writing center. With that, thank you for joining us. Have a good night.